I am Dr. Pamela Kryskow. I'm one of the founding board members of the Canadian Psychedelic Association, and I'm pleased to welcome you back to a second part of a continuation update from a webinar we had a while back on Section 56 and Special Access Program exemptions for psychedelic medicine in Canada. So I'd like to introduce you to our guests. Thank you, gentlemen, again for joining us. We have Michael Kydd, who is a regulatory communicator. And we have David Wood, who is general counsel for SciGen, and he is also an independent counsel with a specialty in regulatory law and intellectual property law. And he works primarily or only in cannabis and psychedelics. We may have Dr. Val Masuda joining us if she gets all my text messages. Anyways, Val's great. She is on the board of Therasil and is the medical director of the Roots to Thrive psilocybin, or the medical lead on the Roots to Thrive psilocybin assisted therapy. So, gentlemen, let's jump in. I think there'll be a lot of questions. For people that don't know what's been going on with getting access to psychedelic medicines in Canada, David, would you jump in, please, and give us a historical context of where we have come from?
Yes, no, I'd be happy to. And just for nomenclature, and I think maybe some of the people in the audience might appreciate this, but I like to think that there's no such thing as an illegal drug. I like to think that treason and murder are illegal. Drugs aren't. There are some drugs that are controlled substances. And what most people think of as psychedelics, the best known ones are controlled substances in Canada, like LSD or psilocybin or MDMA, if we're going to use the word psychedelic expansively, to include drugs like MDMA. So where we are now is that since the 1960s, Canada has been party to UN conventions, and those UN conventions require Canada to prohibit possession of certain substances. And we call those controlled substances in this country. And 4 years ago, our government took an international first by regulating cannabis as a consumer packaged good, which meant cannabis specifically is no longer a controlled substance in Canada. However, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and most other well-known psychedelics remain controlled substances. However, probably everyone in this audience knows that prior to 2018, there were people accessing cannabis medically from a federally regulated program that was completely consistent with the law and consistent with those UN obligations. So where we are with psychedelics is that there are a few Canadians who have managed to receive what's called a subsection 56(1) exemption, authorizing them to possess and consume psilocybin. That is a similar mechanism to what was used in the late 1990s to give people access to cannabis, and was part of the lead up through case law to the government of Canada being forced to create medical access regulations for what at the time was called marijuana with an H. That substance, which we now call cannabis, was accessible through something called the MMAR, which was succeeded by the MMPR, and then by the ACMPR, and then finally by the cannabis regulations under the new Cannabis Act. But those first three, those were regulations under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which allowed people to purchase consumer packaged goods that were cannabis for medical use. So that does not exist for psilocybin today. Some people may think of the special access program that way. That's a misconception. And I'll get to what that is in a second, but a few people have been able to access psilocybin from illicit sources by receiving an authorization to possess it, although no regulated source has been provided yet, through a subsection 56(1) exemption. What has recently happened that many people in the audience are probably aware of is that the special access program was amended. I should say the Food and Drug Regulations Part C were amended to include restricted drugs in the special access program. restricted drugs are controlled substances that are Canada's version of Schedule 1. Our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act does have schedules that are numbered like the American one, but they don't mean the same things that they mean in the US. So in Canada, Schedule 1 doesn't mean no medical use. There are drugs that have medical uses and drugs that do not have medical uses in each of the first 4 schedules of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. But when restricted drugs became accessible through the Special Access Program, that opened a way where a physician, not an individual, but a physician, can ask the government for permission to receive a restricted drug and provide it to their patient. And special access to psilocybin or any other drug, restricted or not, is dependent on there being adequate clinical data that supports the use of that particular drug for that particular indication. And I'm sure we'll get into this more. So that's about where we are with psychedelics today, is that they are a controlled substance, which means by default, they're prohibited. Now I'm talking primarily about psilocybin here. There are psychedelics that are not controlled, but psilocybin is a controlled substance. Its possession is prohibited. Some Canadians, many of them through advocacy supported by TheraPsil, have received subsection 56.1 exemptions authorizing possession, but not providing a source. The Special Access Program was expanded just over 2 months ago to make it possible for psilocybin to be accessed from a regulated source with the support of a physician. And we'll, I'm sure, get more into the details of that later on in the call. Michael, what's your perspective?
I mean, I don't know how much more to add on the history. You've certainly provided a good synopsis of where we started and where we are today. But what I will talk about is, where does the Special Access Program take us today on the regulatory front, and most importantly on the compassionate front, and how the program is designed. And as David just alluded to, it's not a foolproof program that will guarantee any level of access to any patient. Health Canada has been very, very clear about that. In fact, on March 24th, they will be hosting a clinical trials info session, part 2, which will once again reiterate the importance of the clinical trials process and hopefully providing some more clarity around the differences between the Special Access Program and clinical trials. I will say this, though, we have come an incredibly long way with respect to how we are treating patients and how we are actually accessing patients and providing and getting closer to a safe supply, which is desperately needed in this country from coast to coast to coast. My analogy, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a communicator by trade and a government relations professional by trade. So my analogy is not going to be as legal as David posited, but I will say this. In 2020, a not-for-profit organization in the psychedelic space did a fantastic job of lobbying the federal government to get access through, as David mentioned, subsection 56.1 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And in that process, when those 4 Canadians, palliative Canadians, were granted access to their Section 56 exemptions, what I believe happened, what many of us believe, and I've talked to whether they're my clients or people in this industry, from medical professionals right through to regulatory professionals and right through into the government bodies, whether it's in the bureaucracy of Health Canada or different politicians. And what we believe happened is that there was so much pressure put in that situation to grant that access that Health Canada wasn't ready. Health Canada wasn't ready to grant any type of access at that time. But when they did it on a compassionate case-by-case basis, not realizing that what they technically did is let the genie out of the bottle. Okay, that's what happened in 2020. Fast forward to 2021, we had an extensive outreach and lobby from private companies right through to not-for-profit companies trying to access Section 56 exemptions and getting patients the treatment that they certainly deserve and the quality of life that they need. And what that did to Health Canada is it really put them back on their heels. And they started to look at this situation and say, okay, what do we do now? How do we resolve this backlog of 1,000 patients who want access to psilocybin therapy? Because, oh my goodness, what we've done is we've opened up Pandora's box. We don't know how to control this colossal mess that we've created. And what it ended up doing was it brought Health Canada's vision back into perspective and said, well, here's how we're going to fix it. We're going to encourage people to stop the individual Section 56 process and drive them up the middle through the clinical trials process. Makes sense. They're looking for historical research. They're looking for data. They're looking for all kinds of different data points that will, and research that will help improve what we need to know about psilocybin and its efficacy and its overall safety. That is clear cut from Health Canada's own website and from their own discussions that I know that I've had and others have had with them. And what ended up happening is at the end of 2020, when the lobby from all kinds of different organizations had started to take effect around the special access program, Health Canada conducted a public consultation, which is what governments do. And in January of this year, they finally made those amendments to the regulations and repealed certain sections of the special access program, which, as David mentioned, gave potential access to life-saving therapies that would be deemed under a serious or life-threatening condition, and provided some level of access for clinicians to access MDMA and psilocybin. What ended up happening with that is this. Health Canada knew, unquestionably, they knew that when they were having problems with the special access program, with the Section 56 exemptions, they knew that the only way they could really tailor that and bring that back into line was to introduce a special access program. Because what we're seeing now is basically no Section 56 exemptions being approved. There hasn't been a single exemption approved under the special access program as of yet. And that is causing a lot of turbulence within the industry. So here we are with thought we had a solution with the Section 56 exemptions. Health Canada decided that wasn't certainly a way to go about providing the data and the research that they needed. So they brought in the special access program. And what that's basically done now is it's put the genie back in the bottle. And that's where we are today.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Michael. I'll just add to it from a physician's point of view and just maybe adding a little bit of plain language around it. So the physician's experience of the Section 56, with the Section 56, the patient could apply directly, and that was with the assistance of a physician. So the Section 56 exemptions we did, they were started by the patients, some with the assistance of therapists, some with other assistants, but that was patient driven. Now with SAP, it's more physician driven. So the more of the burden goes on top of the physician to do all the paperwork. So now when I fill in an SAP application, I'm filling in all the stuff and I'm taking full responsibility for sourcing the medicine, having it arrive, taking care of it, administering, and then reporting back to Health Canada on the use of that and anything that went well or didn't go well. And contrasting that to the Section 56s, that was the Health Canada was not asking or interested in where the patient was accessing the medicine, whether psilocybin, well, in this case, psilocybin. So in the Section 56, patients had access to psilocybin mushrooms, whereas that is not a door that is quite yet open as a possibility with the SAP. That feel congruent?
Correct.
Your experience?
Sorry, the door being accessing.
Well, right now, so right now, where we're set with with the SAP, so all of the myriad of companies that have their dealer's license in Canada and have the ability to supply under SAP, we have maybe a handful, maybe a few that actually can supply something, and none of them yet are in a position there. I think what we're finding right now is that we have the option of synthetic psilocybin is an option, but we're not yet in a place where anyone is close to providing whole mushrooms, so psilocybin mushrooms for consumption. Whereas under the Section 56 exemptions, Health Canada wasn't involved in that part. You could have, if you could have found synthetic psilocybin, you could have had access to that, or you could have mushrooms.
Yes, the subsection 56.1 exemptions did not provide any kind of source, at least not the ones I've seen. And for people in the audience, just for context, these exemptions have been around. I think, I'm not positive on this one, but I'll make an educated guess, as long as the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act has been around. And it's been that way because the kind of default context for a subsection 56(1) exemption application is when one wants to do research, and that could be a clinical trial. Like, for example, if you were bringing a new time-released opiate to market, you would need an exemption to work with that opiate, because opiates, by and large, and I'd say safe to say all of them, are controlled substances. So not this system, and the system would also have been set up so that people could do research on the harms of drugs, where perhaps they expose animals to different drugs, and look at their effects on the animal's physiology and extrapolate that to humans. That's maybe to some people, myself included, a bit distasteful type of research to engage in, but a lot of that research has happened while we explore, the harms associated with controlled substances. And then lastly, anyone working on any sort of detection equipment, for law enforcement, would need an exemption to receive the material and work with it. And there's many companies that will sell reference standards of controlled substances, but as Pam recognized, the supply chain for psilocybin and other controlled substances is poorly developed. And I work at a company that's contributing to that supply chain, but what I can say with that perspective is that it's not well established, that supply chain in general. That's changing rapidly, but it is still something that isn't, it's a very specialty and niche subset of the pharmaceutical industry to work with these substances, and it's not, there just isn't a large enough volume right now such that these are readily available. And it will be interesting to see, psilocybin's unique among psychedelics, maybe not completely unique, but I'd say unique in its social status, in that it is one that people are open to in general. It doesn't have a lot of the social baggage that LSD or some of the other ones do. And it comes from an organism, and it's got a remarkably low toxicity. So it is, I think, one of the few where there is a realistic argument for, an access system similar to medical access to cannabis. And that would certainly, if cannabis is any indication, be a much more accessible system than the special access program. But we have no idea if a system like that will ever exist. And I think it'll be interesting to see what volume the special access program will be used at successfully. Because as you know, Pam, you have to tie the particular product you're asking for to the particular therapeutic indication or use that it is being used for a given patient. And that all comes back to clinical evidence. And it's, ordinarily we have clinical trials that result in a drug product being approved. But in the case of psilocybin, a lot of these use cases aren't interested in exploring whether or not it works. As you know, that it's clear that it does work. And I think for some patients, especially patients at the end of their lives, but all patients who would benefit from it, I think it's, troubling that the only answer, the default answer would be, well, go find a clinical trial and hope you're not in the placebo group. I'm very, very happy that Health Canada seems open to cooperating with physicians such as yourself, who in their professional judgment see the therapeutic potential of psilocybin, that Health Canada is open to, now that they're allowed to under the law, that they're open to allowing access through the SAP. And again, it hasn't happened yet, but let's all hope that a successful application is issued soon.
I could just add to that. The special access program is, when we first started talking about this, I think we met in February, Pam, if I recall. There were a lot of people who were excited businesses were putting out press releases. People over just generally were engaged and really excited about what this could potentially mean. And I still stand by my statement then that it was a great day for the industry. But we've learned a lot since about what this program is actually going to contribute to the overall development and progression of a regulatory framework in psychedelics, and especially psilocybin and MDMA. And the fact is right now, the special access program is not going to be the panacea that we all thought it would be. In fact, if it's done anything, it's actually potentially set us back. If you're thinking about it from a practical, let's help the patient who's at end of life perspective, then it's definitely sent us back, because we're still trying to find that pathway up the middle on clinical trials. And if Health Canada is adamant, and I'll mention ACMA Journey Centers right now, who have gone through the entire system bit by bit, line by line with Health Canada, developed an incredible relationship with Health Canada to develop their clinical trials process for healthy patients. And they received a no objection letter. Well, they received that because they built a pretty good relationship with Health Canada and understood that from day one, that this was about building the evidence through clinical trials. And, I think that's what, from an industry perspective, we have to understand, is that for the SAP to work, we have to still have the data and the evidence, and that is going to take time. And, that's why we have to continue to build those relationships with folks like Ian McKay, who runs the special access program at Health Canada, and have those conversations up front and find out why, to David's point, why is it that, clinical trials seem to be the only process that you keep hammering away on and wanting industry to develop and build resources in. And there's a reason why we don't have supplies, because the fact is that we don't have the industry yet. A lot of talk out there about industry and how we can generate positivity, but we need to have evidence. But I think if you look at what Dr. Kryskow is doing through her Roots to Thrive program and the Community Thrives program, I mean, that is the bar right there in terms of being able to access patients who are terminally ill and giving them the right to endure the quality of life that they deserve. And this is where I think psilocybin still needs to be pushed through the Section 56 process, but it will be matched up against the special access program in terms of its overall case-by-case analysis by Health Canada.
I want to bring some more clarity to this, especially in case there's people here that maybe haven't heard any of these conversations before. So as a physician, the way that SAP, or the Special Access Program, has worked historically and how I have used it in the past, unrelated to psychedelics, is if I have a patient that has a condition that has, not responded to the medications or the therapeutics that I have in Canada, but perhaps there is an agent in the UK or Australia, what I could do is I could make an SAP application to Health Canada and make the argument that, my patient has done a fair trial of these medicines or these therapies and has not gotten the results. And I know that there is another drug or therapy that has been already gone through the regulators in another country. And then I could make the application to Health Canada to say, I would like access to that medication in the UK. And then what would happen is I would be responsible for connecting with the company in the UK, saying, would you sell us or give us this drug? Would you ship it to me? I would be responsible for taking control of that and then getting it to my patient and reporting back to Health Canada. And so that's traditionally how us physicians have used the SAP program in the past, very successfully, very smooth, very fast. And now what we're doing here and I'm going to tie in a couple of things that both Michael and David have said, is we're being asked to use that same process, but there is not a product out there that we're going to talk about psilocybin or psilocybin mushrooms. There's not a product out there in the market anywhere in the world that is sold as psilocybin standardized mushrooms, as whether a supplement or a drug or like any of the options that it could be on market as. So as something that is put on the market with CGMP, good clinical manufacturing practices, a product that can be sold to consumers. And so nowhere in the world do we have access to this for me right now. Let's say I have Mrs. Smith in front of me and I think psilocybin would be a great product. There's nowhere in the world that I can say, hey, company X, I know you have this product that works for depression and has gone through trials and gone through the regulators. for depression. Would you send me some to Canada? That's what we're expecting. Like that's how we would use it. And so where we're at right now is we have a lot of companies that can grow mushrooms, that can make synthetic psilocybin, but have not gone all the way through the process to be able to put a consumer product, again, whether a natural health product, something in between in some countries, I'm trying to speak for the world, or a drug product. And so we're in this place right now where and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but our last communications with Health Canada on the SAP is they want to see a product that has at least gone through phase one, definitively, safety, has gone through or is going through phase two, which is efficacy, but nobody is all the way through that. And speaking back to David's point, and then I'll go on mute, is that usually like when a drug is on label available for prescription, it means that it has gone through a clinical trial for an indication for a dose or a dose range. So this product for blood pressure, for hypertension at 25 milligrams. So we don't have that. And so let's say we even had that product. Let's say there was psilocybin on the market, depression at 25 milligrams, but I've got a patient over here that's got anxiety related to their palliative care diagnosis. Technically, SAP wouldn't allow it because my patient has anxiety, but the drug psilocybin, the indication is depression.
And even beyond that, in our call with Health Canada in late February that you were on, they were clear that if the evidence that you're relying on in your SAP application is evidence that was obtained clinically using a particular active pharmaceutical ingredient form of psilocybin, then the request you're making better be for the same active, which means if the data was obtained with synthetic, and then you should be asking for access to synthetic psilocybin that has a similar purity profile and equal or better purity. They also made it clear that if you are interested in, and this is not the right word to use here, but a botanical product, which is sourced from fruiting bodies or mycelia or truffles, then that product, even if it's standardized, even if it's GMP, it has to be those things in order to even be considered. The data you're relying on will have to have been obtained with the same product. And that's the position that was communicated to Pam and I and Val and a couple other people that were on the call. And it's a reasonable one because it's different. I mean, anyone who's used different types of cannabis before would understand that, 5 different types of cannabis flower are going to be different from each other. And they're also going to be different from pure THC. If anyone's ever had a THC distillate pen, it's different than everything that comes in the flower. And there's so many companies and academic groups investigating the various tryptamines and maybe even beta carbolines that are in psilocybin mushrooms and how those groups of chemicals may or may not kind of interface with each other. So I understand Health Canada's perspective, and it makes sense that, I do support patients having choice. And that's why I'm very happy that subsection 56.1 remains a way for patients to get permission to possess, but it's very unlikely in my view that they'd ever be given a regulated source under a subsection 56.1 exemption. And the reasons are technical and frankly, probably for most audiences a bit boring, but they are real. So I think it would be wonderful if a set of regulation
Did we lose David?
David, we've lost you for a moment. So maybe James will have you just mute David for a moment and
I can just quickly add to that.
Yeah, jump in, Michael.
Yeah, to Pam's point earlier about about how this industry has emerged from a safe supply perspective. It's very important, and it's one of the things I really like about the Special Access Program is that Health Canada is extending an olive branch here, and they're asking institutes and researchers and physicians and businesses to develop and start to really pull together what that safe supply looks like. It's going to take time. There's no question about that, whether that's from a synthetic perspective or an all natural mushroom perspective. So we have a ways to go on that. And what I think the Special Access Program has done, and what the government has done, just it's clever, is they've given businesses, they've given industry the opportunity to stand up and say, okay, we want bottom line CGMP certified product that we can have brought into clinical trials. It can be used in the Special Access Program, and then take that data back and start to build upon that and provide that evidence back to Health Canada, which is, I think, going to be really important. Is it going to be to the top scientific standards that you would get in a clinical trial? Probably not if you're going through the Special Access Program. But to the other point I want to raise that Pam had mentioned, and she's absolutely right, is we have an obligation to understand where Health Canada is coming from, but more importantly, what does it? Well, so I see Valerie coming in there. Sorry, hey Valerie. So we have an obligation to be good stewards of the industry and producing the kind of quality that frankly Health Canada is going to want and what they deserve. So at the end of the day, if you were to put 10 psychiatrists in a room together, and to Pam's point about treatment-resistant depression or someone who's at end-of-life anxiety, you'd be hard pressed to have every one of them describe what treatment related or treatment resistant depression actually is, because there's so many different variants of that. And that is where I think Health Canada is having a hard time understanding how to actually bring people through the Special Access Program, because it's very hard to define. And if there's a psychiatrist here who wants to comment on that, I'd be happy to hear that. But it's hard to define treatment-resistant depression, and that is going to be problematic for the Special Access Program.
Welcome, Valerie. Nice to have you here. Dr. Valerie Masuda has joined us. Thank you. She is busy, has been busy seeing her patients. So thank you for taking some time out of your busy day, Val. Valerie is with Therasil and also is on Therasil's board, and is also physician related to Roots to Thrive psilocybin assisted therapy. So thank you for joining. I want to, something that's really important also to consider here is, the reality is 99% of the people using psilocybin mushrooms are doing it in the underground. Most people are using psilocybin mushrooms, and it's a very small amount, maybe 1%. I mean, just extrapolating numbers from what I know, are going to be using synthetic in clinical trials. And, unlike drugs, which is what Health Canada is generally used to using, and we should comment on that our counterparts in the US have the Botanical Drug Act, which actually is designed exactly for something like this, for complex botanicals that have many constituents. And it's in a pharmaceutical, you have an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, which is you pin it on, that is the thing that's doing everything. Well, of course, we know nature is much more complex than that, and that there's many active ingredients. And if you have, if you eat broccoli, which part of the broccoli is healthy? It's all healthy. So that is simplistic analogy, but nonetheless, we have a fungi of psilocybin mushrooms, and of which is over 200 psilocybin containing mushrooms in the world that have been around for millennia, have been used historically, ceremonially across the globe, from north to south, east to west, and they have access. And so we're in this interesting situation where it's not a drug stuck in a lab that we're asking access for. It's a medicine that is free. It is a fungi that is freely available to the public. You can walk into a storefront in Vancouver easily on Seymour Street did a couple weeks ago to see it for my own eyes, and you can buy a mushroom product right there. And so you want to jump in, either of you, Val, David, or Michael, on your thoughts on that? Like, how do we how do we ethically move this forward faster than a drug step by step? Like in an API, you have to go step by step by step, whereas we could be jumping ahead using historical use here. And I think we have an ethical obligation, given that people already have access freely.
And I'd just like to set Michael up for something there, because I know, Michael, you're quite open about your work with Optimi, and I know they're cultivating and talk about having GMP fruiting body production. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about, to the extent you're able to, about how their different types of mushrooms might be different? Like, are they investigating that, or if that's something you can comment on?
Well, I wasn't gonna raise it, but I appreciate it. I can't comment on, obviously that's proprietary information, and but I do know that they are in the process of looking at whole mushrooms and natural mushrooms to be part of clinical trials. And there's momentum growing in that space. You look at the work that Paul Stamets is even doing. A lot of people right across the country are finding different novel compounds that can help in the different types of mental health conditions that we need to treat. But I can say that as we get further in down the road, there will be a lot more news and information about how these products are going to be able to provide the safe supply that we need in this country. And to Pam's point, again, the special access program, while it isn't solving the direct patient physician issue that we need to solve, because we have to solve that, it's actually providing a bit of an arms race between businesses to develop these medicines and put them forwards through clinical trials. And I mean, I'm getting calls from clients daily, not even just people in the industry saying, how do I access the special access program? And I've received 10 offers to provide my product to this person and this person, and they want to do it through a Section 56 exemption. And to David's point earlier, I don't think we will ever see that. And if we do, then it's going to be a positive day, because I think we have to look at other ways outside of special access program to get those medicines into the people that need them.
And I agree with that 100%. If there were a way that a licensed dealer could supply an individual under subsection 56(1) with material that individual is going to use medically and consume, that would be a big step forward. I mean, that is essentially what cannabis medical access looks like. And there's no reason administratively, there's no reason in terms of UN conventions, and there's no reason that Canada, with all our experience regulating cannabis, would be unable to set up a regulated system providing psilocybin products. All of that could happen. And that's what I support, because I think it cuts through a lot of the things that are holding back access. And I, like yourself, Michael, I worked with TheraSil on our own draft regulations, which are very, very similar to the cannabis regulations. Because, well, for a number of reasons, doesn't matter why, but it's I have my own reasons, and so does TheraSil, on why that's a good approach. And if a system like that were put into effect, then physicians and their patients would have choices. Because I think when you're talking about something like accelerating psychotherapy, in contrast with shrinking a tumor or killing a virus, you're talking about accelerating psychotherapy. To me, now I don't want to encourage leveraging of the placebo effect, and I'd love to hear from Val and Pam on the ethics around that. But to me, if a patient, because of their belief system, genuinely perceives an additional benefit to using a mushroom fruiting body instead of a synthetic drug, then, and I'm saying this as someone who works at a company that synthesizes psilocybin. So, I really mean this, because it's actually contrary to Psygen's interest in a commercial sense. But like most members of Psygen, I don't have only one bottom line in my work there. We are a true multiple bottom line company. And so if someone believes they're going to get a better outcome, it makes sense for them to have options. And if their physician thinks that synthetic, because of its predictability, is going to be a safer way to go, and the physician helps the person see that, and now the person's more comfortable with synthetic, they should have that choice too. And I think a good medical access system, again, following one, in my perspective, following something written like the cannabis regulations, but more akin to the ACMPR, because it would be under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, because we are talking about a controlled substance here. We want to keep it consistent with UN obligations. Then there's no reason we can't do that. Like, Canada knows how to track and regulate these things. It's the same. There's a barcode on the bottom. It's got a lot number. I'm not going to hold it enough for you to see it, but it's got a percentage of THC, THCA, CBD, CBDA. You could label for psilocin and psilocybin. It's not like this. We can do this if there's a political will. And I think that unlike cannabis, we wouldn't see a lot of order whatever you want, do whatever you want. I mean, when I made my first Aurora order in 2016, I had one that was just CBD, and then 3 of what I'll call real cannabis. And my doctor didn't know what I ordered. He didn't know if I was ordering oil or dried flower or what I was doing it. It was all just unsupervised. I think with psychedelics, and this is very conducive to the way they're used in support of psychotherapy, at least, I think it would be good if there was more observational study going on over top of the work. And I think, Val, you have published data from your work with exemptions probably. So I'd love to hear from you two on that. And also what you think about, the ethics behind helping a patient choose different form factors, and how much relying on the patient's perception of what might be better is, if at the end of the day that gets them through the forest on their mental health issue faster, I guess we ask, what's the harm? And I think personally, the harm of using a mushroom compared with synthetic is, in my view, probably going to be equal. But I want to hear what the physicians think.
Before we go there, Val, I want to bring something else in about this, because I think it's really important, your viewpoint on this. So we already talked about the difference. Like, you've done applications, you've done a lot of applications for SAP and Section 56. And so we've talked about what that process looks like already. But what I want to, and I want you to answer David's question too, but I also want you to jump into, so people can hear, like, what's that like for a physician, and that you are having, like we are writing applications to Health Canada to get access to medicine. Now, what your experience with both and versus, and should, like, this is outside of what we're used to. We're not used to having to ask permission outside of the doctor-patient relationship. You want to comment on that a bit?
Yeah, so, when we talk about a Section 56, this is a patient-driven request where the patient is representing themselves, but with a physician's support. So the physician is not necessarily involved in the medicine, how they're going to take the medicine. They're just saying, my patient can make informed decisions on their own. They're suffering from this condition. They have requested compassionate access, and I support that application. So they're not actually involved in the administration necessarily of this medication. And then, you've talked about the access and whatnot. But, in my experience with a Section 56 exemption, there's no consistency in who is given a Section 56 exemption and who isn't, because this is a bureaucratic decision based on compassion. Literally, it is whoever reads the application, if they feel compassion for that person, they get it. If they don't feel compassion for that person, it can be the same application, but a different person reading the application, they don't get it. So I've seen people with, that have used all kinds of stuff to try to alleviate their existential distress and have been denied, and other people who have stable disease and they say, hey, I'm feeling a bit on a couple antidepressants, I'm feeling a bit of anxiety, I still want to try this, and they get exempted. So, the Section 56 is not, it's not about healthcare, right? It's about who has compassion for a person's personal application. So, I don't think it's the way to go. I think it's a bureaucratic thing. As far as synthetic versus natural product, I think that we have to align with the patient's core value system. I have patients that, they've chosen not to have chemotherapy because it doesn't align with their core values of accessing natural and healthy product, and they want to access alternative therapies. And I'm totally okay with that. It's my job to understand their priorities and core values and align medical treatment with those. And that's what we call patient-centered care. So, if a patient wants synthetic, they should have access to synthetic. If they want natural product, I think they should have access to natural product. And I get where Health Canada is coming from, because the Special Access Committee is about drugs that can come in a form of a capsule or powder or IV formulation that they can put a DIN number on, that they can put a finger on, and they know exactly what, has been applied for. And they said, botanicals are outside our scope. We're not prepared to even, maybe an extract, but we're not prepared to look at this point, a mushroom that's ground up and put in a capsule, or a mushroom that's not ground up and put in a plastic bag. It's outside their scope. They're not comfortable with that. They're comfortable with drugs, so they're comfortable with synthetics. So, and extracts to a certain point. So, for me, the ideal system would be, having like the cannabis, where you have licensed producers, you have a physician it's a physician-patient decision. A physician has a referral access point where they can even access physicians and therapists that are specialists in psychedelic treatment, much like we would refer somebody to other kind of specialist. And that specialist is knowledgeable and skilled in delivering the medicine, whether it be synthetic or it's a natural product, and that there is a system where, we can access that as skilled, experienced physicians in the medicine. We can administer it to patients in a very safe environment. So this is ultimately where we should be going with our ask to the government, and how we achieve that. It looks like it has to be a legislative change to accessing psilocybin.
Yeah, if I could just quickly add to that, I think Dr. Masuda raises a really, really valid point with respect to compassionate access and who's making those decisions behind the scenes. What we have to remember is there is one person, that's it, one person who works 24/7 on call at Health Canada, who reviews every special access program application, just one person. And I think that raises, back to Dr. Masuda's point about access, I think it also raises a question, and a point that I did raise in the last time we had this conversation in February, is who gets to decide before the patient or the doctor even fills out the paperwork to apply for the special access program? Is that decision already made? I think it possibly is. And if you look at it from just a pure affordability, let's just talk about affordability. You have a single parent walking in maybe with 3 children, working 2 jobs, can barely cover their bills, barely cover their rent, may have just been diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic lung cancer. And they walk into their family physician's office or to their psychiatrist and says, I really want to improve the quality of my life by having a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy session. 2 things are going to happen. The doctor's either not going to know what they're talking about, or they're going to potentially have an unconscious bias towards that person and think, well, this person probably couldn't afford the $10,000 to $15,000 that might actually cost. However, if you go over to patient B, who walks in and comes from wealth and comes from an established connections or family and good career, good job, all the socioeconomic indicators that would show somebody who's obviously, doing well in their life, maybe they come in with the same diagnosis. Would that doctor give them access because they potentially have the ability to pay that bill? And I think that's where it's an unconscious bias that we have to really start to look at with respect to how we get accessibility, whether it's through natural or synthetic psilocybin to these patients. And that's a problem that I think, David, from a legal perspective and purely from a regulatory perspective, that Health Canada will need to address in the near future.
Well, and I think it's simple. Whether it's a prescription drug or whether it's something like a cannabis product, the majority of the cost will be services. It will not be the drug, because people let's look at MAPS MDMA protocol. You take MDMA in that protocol on 2 or 3 occasions, and you take between, I think it's 120 to 200 milligrams. That's not a lot of MDMA all told. So the majority of the cost is going to be services. And I think that as the data starts to demonstrate, MAPS Public Benefit Corp did do a cost study that showed that it is cost effective. That was the conclusion. I can't really speak in more detail than that. I just don't know offhand.
Who, David?
But
Cost effective.
okay,
That's the
well,
question. Who's it gonna be?
yeah, right. So if the insurers realize that this is a cost effective way to get people off their back and not using insurance anymore because they're not on $800 worth of painkillers and antidepressants every month, when insurance companies accept that this is a good way to help people stop using insurance money, then I think it'll just happen. And you're right, we do need education, and we do need an understanding that it has to be covered. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Because right now, I mean, look at ketamine psychotherapy. That is not a working person's therapy. It is expensive. And most of the clinics that are focused on it, at least the ones I'm aware of, are, you know, they're trying to get coverage is a big part of their priority list. And I think maybe if ketamine coverage gets recognized, at least with Spravato, because that's on-label usage, I think it should be with racemic ketamine as well, because it's far less expensive, and I'm sure probably the same efficacy or at least comparable. If that gets covered, then people, you know, and I mean, also thinking a little broader than psilocybin, MDMA will be a prescription drug by about 2024. I hope it's next year. And MDMA isn't going to just get handed out. It's going to be used in psychotherapy. And I think once it's an approved drug, the concept of that being covered is realistic. And once MDMA therapy is covered, it's not a big mental leap to get psilocybin therapy covered. And whether that's a $1,400 or $2,000 tablet because it's got a DIN, or a far less expensive product because it's a medical access product that's still quality controlled and everything, doesn't matter. The most of the cost is going to be the therapy. And if the therapy is covered, then that example, the less fortunate person financially that you described, I hope would get the same coverage they would get for other medical care that we provide, at least. And Pam and Val, you, I don't know, maybe have struggled with this, like how to make it make sense for the patients financially. Do you see the possibility that insurers will be able to coverage this? Good.
We've been having lots of conversations with the insurers with WorkSafe workers' compensation. And for context here to fill in the audience, so the MAPS assessment that Michael and David are referring to shows a break-even cost for 3 MDMA sessions, up to 3 MDMA sessions with psychotherapy therapy provided at about a break-even cost of $12,000 US. That's our break-even cost. We've done the same assessment in Canada and the nonprofit program that both Val and I are in. Our break-even cost is 6,000 Canadian, and the psilocybin one is 2,000 Canadian, approximately, in a complete nonprofit break-even format. So the numbers are a winner for disability companies for sure. You know, for every one person that is that you get off the medications or you help their PTSD or their depression, it's about a $30,000 per year cost saving. So it's really a no-brainer. And to Michael's comment about bias, like us physicians are full of bias, absolutely full of bias, and it's based on our knowledge set. The more you know about a topic, the less bias you have. The less you know about a topic, the way more bias you have. So there's a lot of physicians out there that will not touch psychedelic medicines with a 10-foot, 100-foot pole. You know, they are so embedded with the stigma of the war on drugs and the propaganda of that last 40 years that they can't even wrap their mind around the fact that these might actually be medicines that actually showed massive potential in, you know, right up until the 70s and 80s in the case of MDMA when it was scheduled in 1985. And so I really encourage those of us that are MDs or anybody in the healthcare, you really have to come up the learning curve. And there's about 12 really great TED Talks that we have listed on the Canadian Psychedelic Association's website. Go there, watch them, they'll change your mind. Look at the data. There's 80 clinical trials registered right now for psilocybin. You don't get that many clinical trials registered when something is not effective. So and just looping this back into cannabis, when cannabis was, we were all being asked to do the same clinical trials with cannabis, right? And then it legalized, and none of those clinical trials that Health Canada was asking for got done. And so we actually didn't really get those answers. Which strain, for what indication, at what dose? We didn't get those answers. And psilocybin is equally complex. Like I said earlier, 200 plus mushrooms with psilocybin in it. So like we have a huge learning curve to come up. It's not just cubensis, it's, it's semalantiata, it's zapatocorum, it's like cyanescence.
What do you think about, on that point, in Oregon, it's my understanding they're only allowing one strain of cubensis in their system. Val, Pam, do you think that was a wise conservative choice for Oregon or an overly restrictive one? And for the benefit of the audience, there would be zero chance of importing anything under that program into Canada because that program contravenes US federal law. It's a state level thing, which is impossible in Canada because of how our laws work. But yeah. Pam, do you think that was a good kind of first step in the water for Oregon, or do you think they should have broadened it?
Well, I've had the privilege of sitting in on a lot of those committee meetings and learning a lot of that. And I don't think you're ever going to get it completely right for everyone. And I think everybody's going to springboard off of Oregon and hopefully learn from them, and they're willing to meet. I know that the Oregon people are meeting with the Washington people now to help them, because one of the things was that you have to actually consume your mushrooms with the therapists in the therapist setting. Now that was it's a really broad definition. Like that could be in nature on the beach, but then what if you're microdosing psilocybin? They didn't think of that. Well, you can't microdose with your therapist every day, right? A therapeutic low dose. You can't do that. Like they didn't think of that. And so there's a whole bunch of things. And then they also things about combinations, like not allowing people to mix, like you could put mushrooms with chocolate. They hadn't thought, they were saying, no, you can't do that. And we're like, well, a lot of people do that. They make chocolate bars and you have a bite of a chocolate. So there's a lot of things to learn from Oregon. And I think we're really going to learn a lot, and Washington's going to learn a lot, and a lot of other jurisdictions, but we have the privilege that we don't have to do it province to province to province. We can do it federally, which is, takes a lot out of it.
When we have such a good blueprint, right? Like again, Canada, we sell cannabis in stores and we have a way of regulating it. I don't want to say it's a straight copy and paste, but at the level of the product, everything, if we're okay with how cannabis works, then there's no reason it can't be dried mushrooms with indicated percentages of psilocin and psilocybin on the outside. And otherwise, essentially regulated the same, including with the chocolate mixing point, like the same rules that apply to edible cannabis, like the regulatory challenge of having a product that's food but has an active pharmaceutical ingredient in it has been solved. At least to a level that Canada can function at, and we can sell cannabis edibles, we can sell cannabis extracts, we can sell dried cannabis in stores. Everything I just said could happen where psilocybin instead of cannabis is the active. And Val, go.
Yeah, so there are lots of different speaking points, but I think we have to look at it from a Health Canada perspective and say, well, how can we help Health Canada navigate these waters? Because Health Canada sees this, it's all in the press, right? Everybody knows about mushrooms in the last 2 or 3 years. Everybody wants access to mushrooms, and they're like, whoa, how are we going to navigate this? Now, certainly, when we talk about the cannabis example is, they were all set to do these studies, and Health Canada wants the studies on psilocybin as well. But if you just do blanket legalization, then you kind of waste the opportunity to do studies to show that, this works for what and how much and what are the best sources, et cetera, et cetera. So, we should be looking at being able to use these in the right set and setting. So like you said, it's not about the mushroom is cheap. You know, what do they go for, like $50 for 50 for 5 grams kind of thing? But it's the services, right? So you have the therapy before, you have the treatment, you have the therapy afterwards. How do we provide this as a program of services with a psychedelic assisting within the program? Now, you know, the cost per individual, if you do it individually, is like anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 per person. If we do, and Pam and I have been doing this in group, Pam longer with the group ketamine, and we've been starting with the group psilocybin, is, you know, the savings and the ability to provide this medicine in a group context within a community of practice, like it has been done, like over the thousands of years that psychedelics been used in indigenous cultures, right? Within a community of practice is very safe within a program. And those programs need to be publicly funded, because even when you say, okay, you can access this, you know, legally, you can get a legal producer, you have a physician that's going to prescribe it to you, the cost to the patient is still inordinately high. So, you know, for my patients, for most of them, I've been on disability for a year, you know, they have no extra resources. Accessing treatment is way beyond what they can manage. So this has to be within the public system. If it is in the public healthcare system, then Health Canada can do that data retrieval, right? So it gives them the ability to have access to what the effects are, the adverse effects, the benefits, if they actually are able to make these things into programs outside of clinical trials. So this is where I'm thinking clinical trial is going to take forever. If they can do this through program development, we can have access from regular Canadians. I mean, we like a universal healthcare system. We do not. I have patients paying $100,000 for chemo drugs out of pocket. We do not have a universal healthcare system.
If I can just, and you're absolutely right. We've had this conversation before, Dr. Masuda, and I think David said it earlier. They're the best words I think we could be really pushing with Health Canada right now. Observational studies. There's a lower threshold to meet the requirements for an observational study than an actual clinical trial. And Pam, I'd love for you to be able to share with the audience why, because you say it so eloquently with respect to comorbidities and what you'll get in a clinical trial compared to what you would get in a group like yours with different people with different comorbidities attached to their illness. So I think it's critically important that we start to build that relationship with Health Canada on looking at pilot programs, looking at observational studies. They're not as expensive. They provide the same level of data and information. And I think that's if we're looking to, obviously test the safety and the efficacy of psilocybin or another psychedelic, then yeah, we have a clinical trials process, stage, 3 stages. And I think what we could do though is if we're looking at patients and overall the success rate of getting them back to work, looking at veterans and getting them more communicative and building back in their communities and with their families. I mean, that is the kind of success that Health Canada wants to see. And I don't want to wait another 5-10 years to see that. We need to do it now.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to be clear that when I said use the cannabis model, I meant for the products. And that would be the federal government's role, is make it possible to put it in a box and send it to a doctor. After that, the federal government's role, in my view, is over, just like with cannabis, and each provincial college of physicians, of psychotherapists, of whichever healthcare practitioner that's involved would publish their position pieces. And just like medical cannabis was far more difficult to access in Quebec than in Alberta, I'm sure you'd have differences across the country in which indications are considered acceptable by the College of Physicians and Surgeons to write a medical access document for psilocybin, if one of those existed. And then psychotherapy colleges would probably have their own position and their own view on what their members can and cannot do, and where their members would or wouldn't require help from a physician or other healthcare practitioner, or 2 people in the room, or whatever the rules are. I think that would be provincial, but I think it would just be great if the products existed so that they could be accessed. And at universal healthcare, without stewardship of resources, it becomes less universal than it is right now. So I think the program I'm describing, and that, is from different conversations everyone on this panel's kind of generally supportive of, would be low cost, because again, if one of the options is just dried, good production practice similar to cannabis mushrooms, besides being a choice that a lot of patients want to make anyway, that I think could be done safely. And I think it could be done with a predictable potency, with testing and everything. And then again, responsible use would just come down to physicians who are writing documents under appropriate circumstances.
To speak to the clinical trials, I see Dean has a comment here, and I just want to springboard off of what Michael was saying. Is Health Canada has indicated that they would be open to open label, single arm pilot trials to look at this. And the reality is, really trying to do a placebo controlled trial with psychedelics, especially at a spiritual or a large dose, is kind of asinine, in my opinion. You're not going to fool anyone with Gravol or midazolam. Like, you're just not going to fool anyone. So why are we kidding ourselves? And I think the other thing about the clinical trials, which Michael was actually alluding to, is that the reality is the majority of mine and Val's patients are excluded from the gold standard clinical trials. And so this is the myth of good clinical trials, is that the data is real. Sure, the data is real for the people in that trial, but it's not real for my patients because they were excluded. So the person sitting in front of me most of the time in the office would have never been eligible to get into the clinical trial that I am having to use as my practice guidelines to prescribe. And that is a myth that is really handy for the single molecule industry. So we have to be really honest about that. People are complex. They have complex challenges. They have complex situations. They are on drug mixtures that would also make them ineligible to be in these trials. So, we want to be careful about that. But yes, we can certainly do really high quality open label trials that can really test a good clinical question. And I think we can do that. And Health Canada has indicated an appreciation for that may be the way we need to go moving forward.
So I guess with Michael's comment is, do we wait to do open label, single arm clinical trials? Who's going to pay for the cost versus observational studies in patients where, Health Canada says, physician applies for it, they get the permission, and then reports back to Health Canada about what the benefit and adverse effects. I mean, without the clinical trial, certainly SAP asked for that, but it doesn't have to be under the SAP program. It could be under its own program where the program can be publicly funded through the provinces. Like, for example, an open label observational study on the use of psilocybin in the treatment of substance use disorder. Who's going to pay for that? Well, the government should pay for it because there's enough evidence to show that it probably has more benefit than opening 1 million different safe injection sites, right? So, I think there should be some accountability of the province to get involved in this and to support it, as opposed to us just nailing away Health Canada.
When you're physicians and you want this, right? It's not like this is some unqualified opinion, right? You're taking valuable time out of your practice to be here and talk about this. And I know how much you work with psilocybin and I believe with ketamine in your practice. And, I think it's important to let physicians be physicians. And if they believe in their professional opinion that a treatment will work, and there is evidence, it's not just, a complete theory, because there's tons of evidence, and it does so little harm. I mean, at a certain point, it's good to just let you practice medicine and help people.
If I could just add to that, earlier it was brought up, I think David may have mentioned it, and I guess maybe I'm posing a question back to you, David. You had talked about psilocybin being classified as I think you said you weren't supportive of it being classified as a natural health food product under Health Canada regulations. If that's the case, I'm curious to know why, because a lot of the discussions that I've had with different scientists, chief science officers, you name it, within the industry, a lot of them are of the mindset that we need to start pushing Health Canada to look at classifying psilocybin as a natural health food product. And in some circles, people are saying, well, that's a 10-year project and, you know, we're a ways away. And others are saying that's could probably be done in 2-3 years easily. So why aren't we looking at taking, we talked about the efficacy, we talked about harm reduction, we talked about, we haven't really gotten to diversion tonight. That is Health Canada's biggest concern. So you look at the diversion risks that were perpetuated through cannabis and where we are today with psychedelics. That is Health Canada's chief concern, is diversion. And Pam, you know that, we've had that conversation with them many times. And that's an issue that we have to certainly build upon. But I'd like to know, if we have a lot of this anecdotal and some of the scientific data, why aren't we fighting to put this into under the regulations for natural health food product?
Natural health products are legislatively, a controlled substance is excluded from being an ingredient in an NHP. That's just, it's part of what defines an NHP as what it is. And now I don't have it here to hold up on camera, but I can go to the cannabis store and I can buy some soft gels that have 10 milligrams of THC in them. And I can buy soft gels that have as much CBD as you can fit in there in them. And I kind of use those like natural health products, not the THC ones, but the CBD ones, I take them with my vitamins and I'm taking them for a natural, to me, it is a natural health product, but it's not under the regulations an NHP. It's a cannabis product. The natural health product regulations, they have a schedule 2 in those regulations is prohibited ingredients. One of them is controlled substances. To me, that's a sensible line to draw, because controlled substances are subject to UN controls. They're subject to treaty obligations, and putting them in a natural health product would probably be outside of those obligations, which is again why I think regulations under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act that create a new product category called a psilocybin product, or whatever you want to call it, that is allowed to have psilocybin in it, that could then look just like whatever NHP you're looking at. And there was a proposal, I believe it probably was a COVID casualty because the consultation period ended in September 2019, but there was a proposal to have something called cannabis health products brought to market. Now, the cannabis regulations have a section called drugs containing cannabis, which is a drug product regulated under the Food and Drugs Act that happens to include cannabis as an ingredient. And that has its own, basically the Cannabis Act applies to manufacture of such products, but not to their approval. You could do the same thing with natural health products and make cannabis an allowed ingredient. Like our laws could do that. And you could do that with psilocybin. But to me, because these compounds are psychoactive, probably doesn't make, like there's no such thing as a over-the-counter or prescription NHP, right? If it's an NHP, it's just on the shelf next to the children's vitamins. So now we're getting into funny story time. Yeah, but
we need to find a way. And I'll tell you why, because we have people all across this country trespassing on Indigenous lands, foraging for mushrooms, and completely disrespecting the traditionality of these medicines. And this is a real problem. And I'm hearing a lot about it from Indigenous leaders right across the country. We're talking about legislation and different regulations, and to hear the regulatory and the legislative arguments. I know all that stuff, and you know that stuff, David, but we need to get out of the courtroom and stop looking at this stuff and find solutions to Health Canada that we can sit down and say, how do we move this the right way? Maybe it's not through the Food and Drug Health Drugs Act. Maybe we need to find a way to bring psilocybin to market so that we can remove some of those restrictions that are causing so much grief right now. And it's not just impacting us on the regulatory side for just trying to get this stuff into the doctors and patients' hands, it is going to tie us up for years when Indigenous populations start to file section, charter challenges on this stuff too. So we're not just talking about 2 or 3 years away. We're looking at 10, 15 if we don't do this right now.
I'll predict that if we do have a regulated system, kind of immediately, to the extent it's not already happening, First Nations are going to go for it just like they did with cannabis, and probably just like with cannabis, it will seem unpalatable to interfere with law enforcement, right? Like but I agree with you that they shouldn't have to do that in defiance of the law. And just like there are First Nation owned if a psilocybin medical access program regulated under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act comes into being, I predict that there will be a large number of First Nations that will apply for licenses, or businesses based on those First Nations will apply for licenses. And I strongly hope that, unlike with cannabis, there is some consultation this time. And I'm from Saskatchewan. I understand. I grew up in Prince Albert. I have many friends growing up that were First Nations. I understand like these social issues. I understand Aboriginal law. I don't like that term, but although it's not as bad as the name of their act, but what I'd say for sure is that we have a duty to consult when it's relevant. I know that from law school, and that duty was overlooked with cannabis because psilocybin mushrooms were used traditionally. That duty to consult is inescapable if there's going to be a regulated system. And that also starts to speak to usages outside of a medical context. And that's a far different discussion. But to me, if there was use of psilocybin mushrooms traditionally, then it does not make sense that there wouldn't be now. And as a First Nation I was speaking with pointed out, when they exercise their hunting rights, they don't use bow and arrows. They use vehicles and rifles. So if their traditional use of psilocybin could extend to using LSD, I don't think that's a crazy idea if they see the same role in their society, much like a hunting rifle might replace a bow and arrow. But I agree with you. I as someone who I feel has maybe not a perfect, but an above average understanding of the considerations there, and mindful of what happened with cannabis, if this goes ahead at any level, I really, really hope that there's better consultation with First Nations.
And you know what? I'll just
hopefully
quickly add to that. I'll quickly add to that. Catalyst Conference, that's exactly what we're doing. We are calling for public consultation. Health Canada will be at that event, and we'll be having that dialogue with them to look at how we can build better relationships in Indigenous communities around psychedelics. And I think that is a critical piece to moving us forward towards reconciliation and so many other things that we need to do right around these traditional medicines.
And the wonderful thing about this is that psilocybin mushrooms are circumpolar. And so no matter where you originally came from, it's pretty likely that your ancestors somewhere in your lineage had access to a mushroom containing psilocybin. So circumpolar thing. The other thing I think we need to do some education of Canadians, because you'd think the organic cow farmers would be having more of a concern with people encroaching on their land. So I always like to leave things a little bit hopeful. So let's as we wrap this up, and thank you all so much for being here. This has been great. I think we've educated on all sorts of levels. We'll have to reconvene in a couple months to see where we're at. I think this stuff is moving faster than we ever thought it would. I know it's not moving fast enough, but it is moving faster than I ever thought it would. And so on a hopeful note, where do you hope we are when we come back in a few months? Or if we have some kind people at Health Canada watching.
I'll add to that, Pam. I know for a fact there are champions in Health Canada right now who really, really want to see regulations move forward. There's no question. I've talked to them. They've been very supportive, and they're doing incredible work behind the scenes to make that happen. I also know that the health minister gets it. he is very supportive of psychedelics and is very interested and encouraged by what he's seeing. So I think we're close, but still just a little out of reach. But look, I see a lot of positive signs that are happening in the industry right now. We're having conversations with Health Canada about safe supply. They're reaching out to us and asking us help them map out what safe supply could potentially mean towards regulations in this country. That is fantastic news. And I think to David's point, we do need a regulated framework. If we were to put that in place today, it would solve a lot of the issues that we're talking about right now.
I'm also putting in, there's been a couple of questions and then I'll hand it over to Val. There's been a few questions about the Health Canada meeting. I'll put in the person who you can email at Health Canada to request an invite. So just hold on while I get that in there and I'll hand it over to Val. Where are we going to be in a couple months and what do you hope for?
Well, I hope in the next few days, I get a letter from Health Canada saying they've approved my SAP for 8 patients that we currently have in a group therapy program. I'm hoping that, you know, we get a little bit more buy-in provincially and looking at more like how does the public access this in a safe program, not just, you know, Joe Blow can have a mushroom. It's just how do we provide the services that surround that in a public forum? Because Canadians deserve that. You know, these are really, Canadians deserve healing. And this is something that all Canadians should have, not just the people that can afford to fork out $2,000 to $5,000.
David?
Quickly to that, Dr. Massoud, I'll tell you, I've met with the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions in Nova Scotia and in Ontario, and provinces are really starting to pay attention here and are looking for ways to support and train and invest funds into building not just an economy, but improving mental health outcomes. So that is happening and it's pretty exciting.
And where I hope we are in, you said a few months, let's say 6 months, I really hope that we're hundreds to maybe over 1,000 SAP requests granted in Canada. I hope we see SAP requests granted for MDMA as well. And I hope we have something beyond zero, maybe a bill being drafted for regulation of psilocybin, because I really do believe that is a net positive to Canadians. And we don't have to overthink it. We already turned a controlled substance into a consumer packaged good. A consumer packaged good that's available only under authorization of a physician is still a consumer packaged good. We can create the supply chain. And as more than one of you observed, the provinces are paying attention, the colleges are paying attention, and they can get ahead of this. I mean, I don't like to compare psychedelics to cannabis except in their social role, but it's an unavoidable comparison, and I think we can do a better job than was done with cannabis. We know more as a country, so that's where I hope we are before the end of 2022.
Okay, well, let's make it so. Thank you so much for all your hard work, all of you that are really contributing to moving the landscape here in Canada forward thoughtfully, scientifically, and meaningfully for our patients. For all of you that watched today, thank you. The webinar will be available as a recording in about a week's time. So thank you. And if you're not already a member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association, we encourage you to join because we're doing a lot of good work here and we have a lot of amazing people working really hard to do some really wonderful, thoughtful things in Canada. And as Michael mentioned, Catalyst 2022, May 20th to 22nd, 23rd in Kingston. There are some amazing panels that are going to be there. So we hope we see you all there soon. And this will be turning off suddenly. So I just want to say thank you to all of you so much. And we'll be back in 2 months in the future, having moved this forward.